Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. My name is Ali Ahmad, and I am Director of the Energy Policy and Security in the Middle East program here at the Institute. So thank you so much for coming in such stormy weather. I salute you all for challenging the rain. Today we have a very important topic to talk about. Currently in the Middle East, we have 6 countries that are interested in nuclear power. We have Iran, which operates the only reactor, the Bushehr reactor. We have the United Arab Emirates that is currently constructing 4 reactors. And we have Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, with all of them ambitious plans to expand in nuclear power as well. Because of this, we have to really examine nuclear power in the Middle East more closely, particularly from safety and security perspective. Today's panel focuses on security, and I am really happy to introduce or to have with us 4 distinguished speakers and colleagues to talk about these important issues. Before, I would like just to give a brief introduction of each of our esteemed speakers. So starting from my left, we have His Excellency Hossein Mousavian. Mousavian is a research scholar at Princeton University, programs on science and global security. He is a former diplomat who served as Iran's ambassador to Germany from 1990 to 1997. He was also the head of the Foreign Relations Committee of Iran's National Security Council between 1997 and 2005. And he was also spokesperson for Iran's nuclear negotiation with the European Union between 2003 to 2005. Dr. Mousavian has a PhD in international relations from the University of Kent in the UK. Then we have Professor Rebecca Johnson. Professor Johnson is the founder and director of the Acronym Institute, and from 1997 to 2009, editor of the journal Disarmament Diplomacy. She is the vice chairman or vice president of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK and a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She has a PhD from the London School of Economics. After that, we have Professor Frank von Hippel. Professor von Hippel is a senior research physicist and professor of public and international affairs emeritus in Princeton University program in science and global security. He co-founded Princeton's program on science and global security and was co-chair of the IPFM, or the International Panel on Fissile Material, from 2006 till 2014. Professor von Hippel worked on fissile material policy issues for over 40 years. He has a PhD in nuclear physics from Oxford University. Also, we are lucky to have Professor Zia Mian. Professor Mian is a physicist. Plenty of physicists on this panel. Professor Mian is a physicist and co-director of the program on science and global security at Princeton University. Zia has been with the program since 1997. He is also the co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Material and co-editor of Science and Global Security, an international journal of technical analysis for arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Professor Mian received in 2014 the Linus Pauling Legacy Award for his accomplishment as a scientist and as a peace activist in contributing to the global effort for nuclear disarmament for a more peaceful world. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Now I would like to hand over to Professor Mian to tell us more about the International Panel on Fissile Material and why it is in Beirut.
Yes. So my job is to tell you why we are here. So the reason that we're here is that for the last 3 days, we have been having an international conference that has been hosted here by Dr. Ali Ahmad and the Institute for Public Policy. so that the International Panel on Fissile Material, of which many of the members are here, could have a discussion with experts from the Middle East about the nuclear challenges facing the region. And so I'm just going to say a few words about the panel and what it does, and then my colleagues from the panel will talk about some of the key things that we're interested in. So the International Panel on Fissile Materials is a group of non-government experts from 17 countries that was founded in 2006, and it's based at Princeton University. And what the panel tries to do is to develop the technical and policy basis for international processes to deal with the threat of materials that can be used to make nuclear weapons around the world. To just give you a sense of the scale of this threat, there is enough nuclear weapons usable material, the highly enriched uranium and plutonium that is the core of nuclear weapons, to make more than 100,000 nuclear weapons. Wow, that was, it was very dramatic, but not intentional. Now all of that material is actually not in weapons. There's only about 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, but there's material for a lot more. And what the panel tries to do is to work with governments and experts and academics and civil society organizations to try and think about what's the best way of dealing with this vast stockpile of material in the world, and try to develop a common understanding for approaches to reduce these stockpiles, to end the production of more material, and to help lay the basis for a world that is free of nuclear weapons usable material. Because if you don't have the material, it becomes that much harder to make nuclear weapons. The conference we've had here today is one of a series of conferences that we've held around the world over the last 10 years. We've had meetings in London, in Beijing, in Tokyo, in Rio de Janeiro, in Washington, D.C., in Ottawa, many other countries, engaging with these kinds of issues and these kinds of problems. This is our first meeting in the Middle East. And so we're especially happy to have been here and had the opportunity to discuss these issues with our colleagues. And just to give you a sense of the kind of richness of the discussion, there were people from 18 countries that were part of the discussion here today, with people from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from Jordan, from Turkey, from Egypt, from Algeria, as well as people from Lebanon, and from the people who are members of the panel who came here to be part of these discussions. So let me conclude by saying that we are very grateful to the American University of Beirut for hosting our meeting and for making it possible, and to all of you for coming to this discussion to hear some of the things that we want to share with you. Thank you.
Our first speaker is His Excellency Hossein Mousavian, who will talk to us about the road from the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, to a nuclear-free Middle East. Your Excellency.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks to IPFM, thanks to AUB, Zia and Ali, and all other colleagues who made excellent job to manage this event in Beirut. The topic of my talk, as Ali said, is the road from the Iranian nuclear deal to nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. My first point is about two very simple facts. One, the Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Initiative agreed by United Nations in 1970s, it has failed for 40 years. Despite of hundreds of meetings, many resolutions, we are at the point zero on the implementation of UN resolution on nuclear weapon-free zone. The second fact is the initiative of WMD free zone initiated in 1996 by Egypt and supported immediately by Iran in 1996, it is also failed after 20 years. My second point is that there is no hope these two initiatives we would notice any progress on these two initiatives soon. Because Israel is the only country in the region with hundreds of nuclear bombs. And the world powers are not serious at all to convince Israel to join NPT, to dismantle the nuclear bomb, to realize the two initiatives, the two resolutions, 40 years old, 20 years old, resolutions of United Nations. And as long as Israel is going to have its nuclear bomb, there is no meaning for nuclear weapon-free zone in Middle East or WMD-free zone in Middle East. Israelis always, they have linked this issue to peace process, their existence, and after 50, 60 years of Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, today everyone understands also peace process is failed because Netanyahu has declined the two-state solution, and there is no hope even for peace process. That's why I personally have no hope in coming years any of these two initiatives would have any progress at all. My third point is about the fact the Middle East today is engulfed with multiple crises, which I don't need to explain for you. Terrorism, civil war, sectarian war, failed states, and practically the region is on the verge of collapse. Therefore, there is an additional big risk for the security and the stability of the region. And the fourth point is the fact the terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, today they have access to material and technology of some weapons of mass destruction like chemical weapons and even missiles. You heard yesterday ISIS used against Iraqi forces chemical weapon in Mosul. And they have already used in Syria, and the terrorist groups now they have access, and they may be able to have more access to other weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, there is a big risk on the current situation in the Middle East. And the fifth point is the fact the Middle East does not have any regional security cooperation structure. Practically or realistically, the lack of regional cooperation system in the Middle East caused inviting the foreign countries and are the source of many wars in the region, in the Middle East, source of many rivalries in the Middle East, and the lack of security cooperation in the Middle East is another issue. About the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal known as JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. First, it is agreed internationally, there is consensus that it provides all objective guarantees on non-diversion toward weaponization. Second, it contains the highest standard of transparency ever negotiated during the history of non-proliferation. And definitely, if the world powers, if international community is serious for nuclear global zero, this is the best blueprint toward strengthening the global zero or global non-proliferation. And at the end, the fact is the Iranian nuclear deal represents a new non-proliferation standard. It is much more comprehensive of the NPT regulations that we have experienced last 40 years. 4 major limits of JCPOA, which we would encourage to use these principles on to regionalize practically these principles as a way toward nuclear weapon-free zone is first the limit to stockpile or stockpile of high enriched uranium. It is one of the principles of Iranian nuclear deal. The second is about production of plutonium reprocessing. And the third is about capping at enrichment at 5%. I'm sure you know there is two ways to make nuclear bomb, one through enrichment, one through reprocessing. If you have no reprocessing, there is no way to make nuclear bomb through reprocessing, plutonium processing, or if you don't have enrichment above 5%, there is no possibility to make nuclear bomb through enrichment. And the fourth principle is, as I said, that implementing the highest standard of transparency, inspection, verification measures. Now, with this, I would come to the main point. Since I'm disappointed very much, and I don't see a good future for the two initiatives of nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East and WMD-free zone in Middle East, I believe there is a chance for a sub-regional initiative. When we are looking at the crisis in Middle East, Iran and GCC, Iran and Saudi Arabia, they are playing major roles in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and they are practically, Iran and Saudi, they are the two powerhouses of Shia Sunni, playing huge role on major regional crises and beyond the region. If we are going to go for only one case, a piecemeal agreement, only on nuclear weapon-free zone, it won't work. Because there are a lot of other issues very important between Iran, GCC, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the regional countries. But if we can work on a broader security arrangement, cooperation, regional cooperation, security arrangement in Persian Gulf between Iran, Iraq, and GCC, which would include security concerns, security cooperation, economic cooperation, political cooperation, then we would be able to have, to regionalize the principles of Iranian nuclear deal, first in a sub-region, which would definitely guarantee no nuclear weapon-free zone in the Persian Gulf. Second would be practically would realize nuclear weapon-free zone in the Persian Gulf rather than the whole Middle East. And third would be very much easy for the members to go for WMD-free zone because the biggest issue is nuclear. If they can agree on the nuclear, they would agree easily on biological or chemical weapons. Already all of these countries are members of these three conventions. And the multilateral enrichment, we had long discussion in our IPFM session before this public event on possibility of multilateral enrichment. This can be also an element of this regional cooperation. But this cooperation should be a broad cooperation, a new security structure, cooperation structure, from economic to security to regional issues to political issues. Then we would be able to bring all of this and to realize nuclear weapon-free zone, WMD-free zone, using the principles, because the Iranian nuclear deal has been negotiated practically for 12 years. And perhaps about 200 nuclear scientists from the P5 plus 1 members, 6 world powers, at least from September 2013 to July 2015, they have had hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of negotiations from Russia, China, US, Europe. Americans, I think they had over 50 nuclear scientists in the nuclear negotiations. They have created a very comprehensive 170 pages of a deal which definitely closes all pathways toward weaponization and guarantees the maximum level of transparency which internationally exists even beyond the current NPT regulations. Therefore, I believe there is a chance, first of all, to strengthen the Iranian nuclear deal rather than to play or to undermine or to tear up the deal. Second, to regionalize. Third, to use this deal as a road, as instrument for realizing nuclear weapon-free zone, if not in the Middle East, in a sub-regional.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Please note that we will be collecting questions after all the talks. Our next speaker is Professor Frank von Hippel, and he will be talking about using Iran's nuclear agreement as a stepping stone to a Persian Gulf nuclear weapon-free zone. Professor.
Thank you very much. I'll be, I think the Ambassador Mousavian has given an excellent overview, and I'll give some more details on the idea of a Persian Gulf nuclear weapons-free zone. Just in it's the Persian Gulf, and also then as a model for a global regime to strengthen non-proliferation and to lay a basis for nuclear disarmament. So I'll talk about, just give a little pedagogical background as with regard to the routes to the bomb, then talk about the elements in the agreement with Iran that could be generalized to the region and ultimately globally, and then talk about verification arrangements. So this is the pedagogical background. The natural uranium has two isotopes in it, and both of them each of them provides a route to the bomb. 0.7% of natural uranium is uranium-235, which is a chain-reacting isotope, and if it's separated out from the natural uranium, for example, with centrifuges, then you can use it to make a fission explosive. Typically in weapons, it's 90% U-235, but anything above 20% U-235 is considered weapons usable. Now the U-238, which is the bulk of natural uranium, is not naturally chain reacting, but in a reactor, if the uranium-238 absorbs a neutron, becomes uranium-239, and that decays into plutonium-239, which is chain reacting, and then the irradiated uranium, fuel, for example, out of a reactor, can be processed chemically. Plutonium has a different chemistry than uranium, and you can separate that out. That's called reprocessing. And it has to be, because of the great radioactivity the fission products, which are mixed in with the plutonium, it requires this chemical reprocessing has to be done remotely behind very heavy, thick walls, and therefore this is an obstacle. And if you keep the spent fuel from a reactor unreprocessed, the plutonium is relatively inaccessible. So the key limits in this joint comprehensive plan of action, which we call the Iran deal, apply for about 15 years. Some of them longer, but the key ones for about 15 years. And it's important for us to use this time to build a longer term arrangement, which will apply not just to Iran, but to all the countries in the region, ultimately all the countries in the world, to make this a safer world as far as nuclear weapons is concerned. So the first constraint is that Iran will not reprocess any irradiated uranium. One of the fortunate elements of the situation is that Iran is not interested in reprocessing, and has said that even after that constraint expires, it doesn't plan to separate plutonium. Now, there's part of a potential Iranian plutonium program was the Arak reactor, which is a heavy water reactor, which Iran has constructed, which looks very much like the Cirrus reactor in India, with which India obtained the plutonium, much of the plutonium for its nuclear weapons program. That reactor will be redesigned to produce much less plutonium in its fuel, as an additional element of safety against the plutonium route to the bomb. And in fact, furthermore, the Iran has said it would be happy to send that irradiated uranium out of the country to Russia. So that has pretty well dealt with the plutonium route to the bomb, and I think it's a good model. Now, the second constraint is no enrichment of uranium above 3.67%, which is an enrichment level which would be used in the Bushehr reactor, the first nuclear power plant that has been built in Iran, and a limit on Iran's stock of enriched uranium, which would basically mean that Iran, if it all of a sudden broke out of this agreement, would not have much pre-enriched uranium to feed into its enrichment plant, and therefore would have to produce highly enriched uranium, would have to start with natural uranium, and it would take about a year with the limited uranium enrichment capacity the limit on the enrichment, the number of centrifuges that Iran can have during this period. Finally, the verification arrangement includes challenge inspections by the IAEA any place of concern, and strict verification of the uranium mining and centrifuge production to ensure that there is no undeclared enrichment program developed in Iran. Now, so the first element of an agreement, a larger agreement, would be for every country in the Persian Gulf, hopefully ultimately every country in the world, to accept this constraint that of no plutonium separation. As I'll explain, there's no good reason to separate plutonium. I note here that there is one country with plutonium separation activities in the region, which is, of course, Israel, whose nuclear weapons program is based on plutonium, which is just dramatizes the danger of having a plutonium separation program. Now, at one point, it was thought that plutonium would be the fuel of the future for nuclear power. The origin of civilian reprocessing program dates back to this concept that there would not be enough natural uranium that one could base nuclear energy on the U-235, which makes up only 0.7%, and it would be necessary to develop reactors which could turn the rest of uranium into plutonium. Those were the so-called plutonium breeder reactors. And globally, the industrialized countries spent about $100 billion, more than $100 billion, on trying to commercialize these reactors. They turned out, they are not cooled by water, they're cooled by liquid sodium, and that was their downfall. It's very costly, and these reactors this liquid sodium, if you expose it to air or water, burns, and it's very difficult to keep the sodium isolated. So these reactors failed commercially. It turned out that there was more uranium in the world than people, 1,000 times more high-grade uranium in the world than people anticipated. And so the cost of uranium is a very small part of the cost of nuclear power. So there are still countries which have plutonium programs. Russia and India are still trying to commercialize breeder reactors. Two countries that have failed to do so, France and Japan, are still reprocessing their spent fuel and are using that fuel, that plutonium, to make fuel for their water-cooled reactors, which reduces their uranium use by 10%, but the plutonium fuel it costs 10 times as much as the low-enriched uranium fuel that would otherwise be used, and so these programs make no sense. And any utility which has a choice of whether to have continue reprocessing or not chooses against it. But these two countries, the governmental bureaucracies are still forcing their nuclear utilities to reprocess their spent fuel. I don't think it'll last much longer. But anyway, so that's now the alternative to reprocessing is to store spent fuel and ultimately to dispose of it deep underground. The practice, a few countries are now on the verge of actually disposing spent fuel deep underground. But most countries, have had political problems with this, and this is what most countries do. Is basically cool the spent fuel from the reactors in pools, and then put it in dry cask storage where it's air-cooled and relatively safe. In the United States, we actually put the casks outside. In Germany and some other countries, they have the casks inside buildings. We have to deal with Dr. Mian mentioned how much plutonium and highly enriched uranium there is in the world. Most of it is a legacy of the Cold War. It has to be dealt with. There's also the legacy of these breeder programs. Fortunately, the Middle East has very little plutonium and highly enriched uranium to deal with. Only in Israel, there's separated plutonium only in Israel. And there's only a small amount of highly enriched uranium, which was used for research reactors in Iran and in Israel, which has to be dealt with in spent fuel. So that will be relatively easy to deal with, the legacy, this legacy. Now, the other route to the bomb is through enrichment, and at this point, only Iran has an enrichment program in the Middle East, and if other countries imitated Iran and developed national enrichment programs, they each would have a potential nuclear weapons program, and so which would be destabilizing, and it was also uneconomic. So globally, this is the situation with regard to uranium enrichment. That there are 4 major enrichment programs which supply the rest of the world. There are 30 countries with nuclear power plants. Russia has 3 weapon states, Russia, China, and France have major enrichment programs. The way I've indicated their size here is by the number of 1,000 megawatt power reactors the capacity of each program could support. And then the other enrichment program is a multinational enrichment program, which is owned by Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. And they have plants in those 3, enrichment plants in those 3 countries, and also in the United States. The United States does not have a commercial enrichment program anymore. And then there are 4 small enrichment programs in the world, one of which is Iran, one which is Japan, Argentina, and Brazil. The Argentinian, Brazilian programs are legacies of from the military programs before they joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Iranian program, is of course has been a focus of tremendous concern, and Japan's program is basically a failed commercial program. So the thought is, could we put Iran's enrichment program under a multinational control, the way the programs are in Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK and the US, and there's openness of the Rouhani administration to discuss this. There's a quote here from the head of the Atomic Energy Organization. I hope that they win the election that they will have soon, and that these discussions can be developed. So, and then the question is, who would be the partners of Iran? Would other countries in the Gulf, also other countries from outside the Gulf, for example, the members of the P5+1 countries which negotiated with Iran on this deal? And there's also the question of where would this enrichment program be located? And in my wild optimism, I suggest maybe an island in the Persian Gulf. This would be seen as the least threatening location for the compromised location for the countries in the Persian Gulf, around the Persian Gulf. So finally, the IAEA at the moment verifies that the peaceful nature of the nuclear programs around the Persian Gulf and elsewhere in the world, but the question is whether additionally the neighbors would like to inspect each other, and that there is a precedent for that in Europe and in the Brazil-Argentina Mutual Inspection Commission. They preceded the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the establishment of the IAEA as a global verifier. But the question is whether a Gulf organization also would be useful to increase confidence in the Gulf, that all the nuclear activities in the neighborhood were peaceful. Possible. So, but in order to have such an organization, it's necessary to have discussions. And so this last slide just shows some suggestions for beginning topics of discussions. Consultations on nuclear power plant safety, workshops on multinational arrangements, and hosting for training of the experts that would have to be, each country would have to have. And I hope the AUB could play a role in this, and Dr. Ahmad could help start these kinds of discussions.
Thank you very much, Professor von Hippel, for explaining some technical elements to largely non-technical audience. I think we all appreciate that. Our next speaker is Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who is going to talk to us about the UN nuclear ban process and implications for the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad. And I must say, I'm very pleased indeed to have been invited to come and talk to you today about the UN nuclear ban process and implications for the Middle East. Because this is actually, we're standing on the threshold, potentially, and we hope, of history. We have actually the best opportunity that we have seen for 70 years since the nuclear bombs were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the immediate first response. Some of you may even know that the very first resolution in the UN in 1946 was actually a resolution that called for civilian nuclear energy to be under completely international control, and there to be complete nuclear disarmament, to eliminate nuclear weapons really before they got started. But this didn't happen, and what we ended up with was an arms race that at its peak was more than 50,000 nuclear weapons. And yet, on the 27th of March, this month, less than 2 weeks away, we are going to see negotiations start in the UN General Assembly, in a body of the UN General Assembly, which are pursuant to a resolution to negotiate a legally binding to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. And you heard my Freudian slip, because what do we mean by a legally binding instrument? Well, the majority of states, and here we have a slide, and I'm grateful to Dr. Mian actually for giving me this slide. He'd used it in an earlier PowerPoint that shows that when this came for vote in the UN's Disarmament and International Security Committee on the 27th of October, 123 UN member states voted in favor. 38 only voted against. Now, who were those? And there was 16 abstention. Who were those 38? They were what we call the nuclear dependent states primarily. They were the 9 nuclear armed states plus NATO. And then there were some wobbles around states that also have nuclear deterrence relationships with the US. But that resolution was called L41, and in fact it was then underscored and confirmed by the UN General Assembly just before Christmas. So actually the numbers were slightly down because a number of the UN missions in New York had actually gone home. But it was the whole of the UN General Assembly, not the committee, but the whole, by 113 votes to 35, confirmed this to negotiate a legally binding instrument. And this picture shows a demonstration of a group of us from ICANN at the time that the Japanese peace boat had just arrived in New York, carrying a number of survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, which are called hibakusha. And you can see some of them here, and you can see the ICANN banner and the peace boat. The boat also carried quite a large number of students from a lot of different countries who'd gone from London to New York doing seminars all the way and workshops about the role of youth and young people to push governments towards a nuclear ban treaty. And they arrived in time to actually see the UN General Assembly take that vote. Well, why do nuclear weapons have to be banned? After all, we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was signed in 1968, and it has 180 something. It has 100 and let's see how many states have actually joined. I think it was 192 last time I looked, because some states sort of divide, and then you have a new state join, but it was already in the NPT. There are basically 4 states of the entire international community outside, and that is India, Pakistan, Israel, and more recently North Korea in 2003 it was a member state, it pulled out, and now, as we know, it's conducting nuclear tests and saying it's got nuclear weapons and developing that. So one of the major problems with the NPT is that it doesn't fully cover all UN member states. And one of the problems is that when it was negotiated at the height of the Cold War, it had a weird kind of, unheard of in a nuclear disarmament treaty, very rare in treaties at all. It made a distinction between what it actually defined as nuclear weapon states and all the rest. And the nuclear weapon states were recognized as having done nuclear tests and therefore assumed to have nuclear weapons. This was the US, the Soviet Union at that time, that then transferred to Russia in the 1990s, that obligation, that status, the UK, France, and China. Everyone else was defined as a non-nuclear weapon state. But unfortunately, the obligations were also followed through this two-tier system. And the unintended, and I think it was an unintended consequence, it was a reality of the Cold War that the states that had nuclear weapons at that time, and particularly the US and Soviet Union, insisted that there be a separate provision, separate recognition. And then the non-nuclear countries insisted that there should be some commitment to nuclear disarmament. The unintended consequence ever since then was that the 5 states carried on developing nuclear weapons, and actually to be a nuclear weapon state became a thing of status. To have a nuclear weapon capability carried value, political value. It was considered strategic. It was considered a deterrent, but it also carried all sorts of other kinds of status, and that became a problem. Because what you then got was that until the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall came down, actually there was simply an arms race going in one direction, and that was more nuclear weapons. The Cold War did allow for a pause, and what we did get was some reductions in the largest arsenals. We've heard about the START process and so on and the sort. But actually what we also got was modernization. So we didn't get disarmament. We got a kind of rationalization and reductions. And this slide reminds us that this year, here now, there are 9 nuclear arsenals, not just 5. There was proliferation to at least 4 countries that still have nuclear arsenals. We know that actually there was also proliferation. South Africa, for example, developed nuclear weapons and got rid of them in 1991, when it also got rid of apartheid. And I think these two things were importantly linked. And in fact, South Africa also became one of the leading states, demanding nuclear disarmament under the NPT. And then when they got very frustrated with the lack of progress, particularly after they took the lead together with all the other states which are part of the African continent, to turn Africa into a completely nuclear weapon-free continent under the Pelindaba Treaty. Now, what this shows then are those nine countries, and the fact that despite their own economic poverty problems, social and economic, in 2011, they were spending between them more than $104 billion equivalent. I don't have the most recent statistics, but between them, they actually have still more than 15,000 nuclear weapons. Now, we know the largest part of that is still US and Russian, but there are significant nuclear weapons in those other countries, as far as estimates show. And more recently, we've been seeing, where did I have? Oh, it seems to have gone. Okay, one of my slides got taken out at some point. I was trying to do this. What was a slide actually of the UK nuclear weapons, which a decision was just made last year at the height, just after Brexit, at the height of instability and real economic risk, to spend 205 billion UK pounds on a new generation of the Trident nuclear weapons because the other one is aging. Instead of taking this opportunity to get rid of them, they took the opportunity to commit to the next generation, and that keeps happening. The $1 trillion commitments being made in the US under Obama, who said that he wanted to see the world free of nuclear weapons. So, so those are some of the issues. But also, there started to be, well, and it wasn't by accident actually, civil society decided to start reframing the issue. And we brought into the 2010 NPT review conference with some helpful governments, Norway, Ireland, Mexico, Austria in particular, pushed to get some reference that the use of nuclear weapons under any circumstance would violate international humanitarian law, to pay attention to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And also references to needing to have legally binding instrument that would, whether it's a framework treaty or a standalone treaty, a legally binding instrument or set of instruments that would actually accomplish the total elimination of nuclear weapons, to which at least the 5 in the NPT had committed to, together with all the non-nuclear weapon states. But importantly, we also started working with climate scientists who had looked at nuclear winter at the time of the 80s, when there were, millions marching around the world to try and get nuclear disarmament. And one of the key arguments that worked with both Reagan and Gorbachev and with public opinion was that if they unleashed the US-Soviet nuclear arsenals, it would cause a climate effect that would cause massive, nuclear winter, virtually shut down agriculture, shut down the earth for decades, potentially, of starvation, really pretty much bomb the whole world into the Stone Age. But more recently, starting in 2008, we've had climate scientists look at, well, that's probably not going to happen now that, Cold War's over and so on. But what could happen, for example, is that India and Pakistan use a few nuclear weapons against each other, or that, there's some kind of a tension, or even by accident. And so they looked at a baseline where India and Pakistan would just use half of their arsenals, but not even half of their arsenals, as if their weapons carried bombs that were only the small by today's standards, of the Hiroshima bomb, which is 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent. What would happen if those were exchanged? And to their shock, these climate scientists who are more used to looking at global destruction from climate destruction and climate warming, could see that this would cause a very abrupt loss of temperature and disruption of the climate due to the dust clouds that would go into the air. This is not just the rainfall out that is contaminated with radioactivity, which would really hit the areas that had actually been bombed. And it also is way beyond the blast and the fires and you know, all the human damage, the millions that would be killed if cities were targeted, and it would be cities. That is what would be targeted. This would be a longer-term effect and could lead to 10 years of reduced temperature. 2 to 3 degrees abrupt cooling would disrupt agriculture. And Dr. Ira Helfand from International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, who's a Boston physician and scientist, actually estimated that 1 to 2 billion dead would die of 1 to 2 billion people around the world would die of starvation, which is one of the most unpleasant ways to go. And of course, it would be the vulnerable people first. It would be the people in countries that already have food insecurity. So is nuclear disarmament desirable? Yes, I think we would all agree. Is it feasible? I'm here to say yes, it is. But it's going to take a lot of work. Is it achievable? Absolutely, yes, it is. Multilateral treaty negotiations that, before they happened, were thought to be impossible, that have banned biological, chemical weapons of mass destruction, as well as landmines, cluster munitions, and various other weapon systems deemed inhumane under international humanitarian law. So what kind of legal instrument do we think is going to start being negotiated at the UN on March the 27th? And there will be a session of negotiations then, and then a longer session running from June 15th to July the 7th. The majority of states are now explicitly saying that they are aiming for a nuclear ban treaty, and they want it to prohibit the use, the deployment, the development, the manufacture, the production, the testing, the acquisition, the stockpiling, the possession, in other words, for the purposes of use as opposed to storage for a temporary period of the transition to being dismantled and disposed of, the transfer of nuclear weapons, these things. And it would contain universally applicable positive obligations for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. It would require the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, and more clearly and more unequivocally than it is in the very fuzzy language of the 1968 NPT. Moreover, the treaty should apply not only to states, but also to their nationals and other individuals and bodies under the state's jurisdiction. This is now increasingly normal under treaties. It wasn't the case at the NPT time, but it is increasingly normal under treaties and also under disarmament treaties. And it also should include, and this is certainly ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, as civil society with, working with Hibaksha and Peace Boat and various others who've worked on cluster munitions and landmines, are also saying somewhere in it, whether it's in preambular areas, if it can't get into language that's in direct obligations, it should be ensuring the rights of victims and survivors of nuclear weapons activities. That means downstream of nuclear weapon production. That means nuclear accidents. That means nuclear testing. That means uranium mining. All of those kind of contaminating and dangerous activities, the assurances to protect people from threats or uses of nuclear weapons. And that's been called for by the non-aligned states and many others ever since 1968. They tried to get it in the NPT, they failed then. This is known as negative security assurances. But also actions to address damage to affected environments, and requirements that when nuclear-armed states sign the treaty, they must conclude agreements with the other states' parties or with an implementing organization on behalf of the other states' parties, which the states' parties would, of course, participate in, regarding the timetable and steps that they will take to accomplish the total elimination of their nuclear arsenals, and that they will ensure that pending total elimination, they will ensure the highest possible safety, security, and environmental responsibility of the weapons chain of custody from storage to dismantlement and disposal, and of course also in international cooperation and assistance to meet treaty obligations, which can also be thought of as positive security assurances. The process leading up to this had conferences in Oslo, in Mexico, and in Vienna. And a lot of young people, ICANN brought a lot of young people there. And this shows some of those young people speaking to that conference of governments in Mexico. And as you can see, you know, from several different countries, and I love these pictures because it does show the next generation taking responsibility. And this young woman is from Iran, and the young man is from Costa Rica. And it's Costa Rica that has been now chosen, the ambassador Elaine White, chosen to be the chair of the negotiations this year in the UN. So my final little bit just to look at is the implications for the Middle East. And we've heard from both sides how difficult it has been to get fulfillment of NPT obligations, even to hold a conference on the Middle East, to get, you know, progress towards a WMD-free zone, and so on. Well, this could help to reframe the needs of the Middle East with regard to getting a nuclear weapon-free zone or a WMD-free zone in humanitarian terms. It would remind banning nuclear weapons under international humanitarian law would be applicable to all states and non-state actors. It would be applicable to non-NPT states. Now, of course, it would be up to each state to decide whether to sign and ratify, but the law, as it enters into international humanitarian law, will not have a two-tier system. We'll have one-tier prohibition-based system and applicable to all, and civil society will be able to work with that. Also, it will be under UN auspices, but it is not being negotiated in a way that can be vetoed. So actually, particularly in the Trump era, where there's a lot of concern about Trump being very unpredictable and will he try to take money out of the UN and try to block or withdraw the US signature from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, more and more states had been thinking they would take a couple of years on this negotiation. They're aiming for a prohibition treaty under international humanitarian law, and they're actually talking about trying to conclude it by July 7th. And this is really important, that the humanitarian framing highlights the devastating regional impacts of any nuclear use or accident in the region with global consequences. And as we've heard, Israel is the only country in this region that have nuclear weapons. We're not even sure how many they have. The estimate is around 80, but we're not sure. But any nuclear weapon use or accident, but also the threat of use, would be prohibited under this treaty, and this would create a different climate of a political climate within which it may be more possible to get some of the technical arrangements that are being talked about. So there have been a lot of protests for nuclear weapons over 70 years, and it is now time to move from the protest to the ban. And don't ever let anyone tell you that young people can't do this, that young people working right across the board, because the first picture shows a group of us at Greenham Common, US Air Base, where they were bringing in a new generation of nuclear-armed cruise missiles in 1983. This was New Year's Day for 1983. And the other picture shows that same nuclear silos now, because within 4 years, 1987, we actually got the US and the Soviet Union to the negotiating room. We got the treaty. The weapons were taken out. They were dismantled. They were destroyed. And this is now practically a museum, but where people take their dogs for a walk and you can see ponies and things. And it can happen that fast if you go from protest to a ban and you have the right strategy. And this very final slide is of the very beginning of this humanitarian process with ICANN, which was at the Oslo conference. And this is a whole group of young people, and not all young because I'm in there, who were thanking all the governments that came to that very first meeting. Because if that meeting had failed, we would not have been able to kick off the process that has led now to the UN starting negotiations in less than 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. I think your presentation was very strong reminder that although since the Cold War, the talk about nuclear weapons, at least within the public arena, has subsided, the risks and the implications are as strong or as catastrophic as ever. But also, thank you for providing a way out of this. Thanks to all our speakers, and now I'm happy to open the floor for questions. If I may suggest that people who are going to ask questions to introduce themselves, and I'm going to take 5 questions in each round. All right. So, Coralie, please.
Coralie Pizon-Hindawi, I'm assistant professor in political studies here at AUB. I worked on some arms control and disarmament issues, and so I'd like to thank you all for your presentations and also this visionary proposal, in particular to build upon the ad hoc process targeting Iran and try to design a regional system that would build upon the same measures to build confidence about non-proliferation, increase transparency, etc. And I very much like this idea to turn what was initially a coercive a process, an ad hoc, to a consent-based and regional one. And I was really waiting for this idea to become more, for this connection to be made explicit between the Iran deal and the zone project. So thanks a lot for that. First, I have a question and then a concern. My question is, I'd like to know how widely shared has this vision become. Professor van Hippel, you mentioned a statement from an Iranian representative, but are there any further signs of a conversation starting there, including on the Arab side? And if you can elaborate a bit on the role the IPFM is playing there or intends to play. Now, turning to my concern. Looking at the region, we had one ad hoc process after the other, targeting Iraq and ridding it of its non-conventional weapons in the 1990s, then Libya, the Iranian so-called nuclear crisis, leading ultimately to the deal, the dismantlement of the Syrian chemical weapons program. So standing today, after maybe 20 years, I mean, looking in retrospect, many of the non-conventional weapons arsenals have been dismantled in the region, yet the prospect of the WMD free zone project seems to be even more elusive than it ever has been. So yeah, one, of course, when one can feel relieved about those arsenals that are no longer there, but at the same time, it seems that there is really, there are not many bargaining chips left to exert any sort of pressure on the remaining nuclear power state in the region. I mean, the only one in the region, Israel. So my concern is with this project of exploring the possibility of a sub-regional zone my concern is that, are we not again going to, push things forward in a direction within a limited group of states and putting ourselves in a position where there will be absolutely no incentive left for Israel to move forward and make any compromise and move towards nuclear disarmament. So that's the main concern I have. And maybe one last super short thing is, now this WMD project in the region has become connected to the NPT regime. So it's no longer a purely regional issue, it's become a global one. So how, well, I'm sure you've been thinking about this a lot, but is there a way maybe to sort of build upon this global dimension of the zone project and the fact that the extension of the NPT was based, among other things, upon this condition to move forward and build a own.
Thank you. We're going to take more questions as well, so our speakers can answer. We can be more time efficient in terms of receiving more questions. Yeah. Abby, please.
My name's Abby Sewell. I'm a freelance journalist. There's been a lot of discussion lately about what the prospects are for the Iran nuclear deal with the Trump administration coming into power, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that, if you have them.
Right. Any other questions? We have
Ali Barjawi. I'm a research assistant with Dr. Ali here at the Energy Policy Program. I have 3 small questions to each of the panel members. For Dr. Hossein, what is the view of Iran on the multinational enrichment program discussed by Ali and the other members? In spite of all the points you mentioned in terms of the regional turbulence, the Saudi-Iran conflict and the lack of trust between the two sides or between all the countries in the region. Also a question for Dr. Rebecca. As most of the things in the UK, it's under revision now after Brexit. Since most of the policies and the constraints maybe are followed by EU policies or fall under the EU policies. So does this apply also to nuclear to the nuclear program, and does this constitute a threat in terms of security? A similar question to Dr. Frank about Trump. Is he taking the position in the US, is the post, would this also constitute a threat in terms of security? Is it a one-man decision? Does he has this key to that button that would explode the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I think we lost. Did we lose speakers? Okay. Any more questions? Nikki at the back. But maybe you have to step forward because I think we lost. Yes.
So thank you, Nikki. I'm a graduate student.
Now it works very well.
So to what extent the current US banking sanctions that are still in place are hindering international companies, especially the European ones doing business in Iran? And in terms of the Iranian perspective on that, how's that being felt with regards to the JCPOA and its actual implementation?
All right. Thank you, Nikki. I think now we have enough questions to open the first round. Can I please ask our speakers to be brief in their answers? So we start with Ambassador Mousavian.
I think by mentioning or proposing a regional forum dialogue between Iran and the GCC by Foreign Minister Zarif in Munich conference, if you listen to his lecture, he went in many details for a regional confidence building through a cooperation system. And be frank, this has been Iranian proposal since 1991. We proposed GCC in 1991, and since then, continuously, we have repeated the same proposal, a regional cooperation system as the only sustainable way for peace, security, stability in the region. The problem is with Saudi Arabia. Some other GCC members, they really like it, to go to a regional cooperation. And the Saudi mindset in principally is to buy security from the US. You know, they are totally dependent on the US arms and security support, and they are far from thinking self-sufficiency in the region, to be independent from foreign powers' interferences in the region. And whether they would be convinced to change their mindset, their idea or not, I don't know. But the Iranian side, they have proposed for 25 years constantly. About multilateral enrichment, it was even President Ahmadinejad, if you remember, September 2005, in his speech at United Nations General Assembly, he proposed an international consortium on Iranian nuclear facility. It was proposed in 2005, even by a president like Ahmadinejad. Therefore, it was not welcomed by the US, Europe, and the regional countries. Therefore, I think Iranians, they would be, and Professor Frank von Hippel mentioned the latest by Salehi, the head of Atomic Energy Organization, stating the willingness of Iran to go to a nuclear regional cooperation. Specifically, he mentioned with GCC in the Persian Gulf to create a regional nuclear cooperation arrangement. At the end, I believe because of many other issues between Iran and GCC, Iran and Saudi, regional issues, international issues, the lack of trust, the history of hostilities before revolution, after revolution, we would need, the piecemeal approach won't work. And we really need a grand confidence building agenda between the regional countries, which I reiterate, Iranians are ready. On US banking restrictions, definitely this has already hinted tens of billions of dollars of agreement between Europe, Japan, Korea, and India, other countries. They have signed agreement, and because of the dollar U-turn transaction and the US sanctions, it is practically on paper. And this is Iranian complaint, but during President Obama, the US Congress extended Iran Sanction Act, ISA, for another 10 years, which Iranians unanimously, they said this is a clear violation of the Iranian nuclear deal. And some members of P5+1, like Russia and China, also they agree that the US has already violated the JCPOA during President Obama. Therefore, if Iran and some members of the P5+1, they believe even Obama has violated, what do you expect from Trump? You know, which is, however, I think President Trump and his administration, they would not tear up the deal. They would let the deal go on, but they would try to undo practically the Iranian nuclear deal through many other sanctions under the coverage, under the umbrella of terrorism, missile, human rights, regional issues. They would bring many other sanctions to undermine totally the Iranian nuclear deal.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to address this question about the sub-regional and the regional and the global first, and then go on to the Brexit question. So, I mean, I cannot tell you, I have attended every NPT review conference and PrepCom and meeting since 1995 and reported on and analyzed. I cannot tell you how many meetings I attended, particularly after 2005, on specifically on the WMD free zone in the Middle East, on how to move towards implementation, you know, with you know, meetings in Cairo, meetings, you know, in Amman, meetings, you know, a number of places in this region, in, you know, in Finland, and, you know, with the designated, Finnish chair with Hans Blix when we were doing the WMD Commission with the League of Arab States, trying to work out a strategy. And that came up with the 2010 proposals, and those got voted through. And then, as we heard, everything got deadlocked. And it was partly seeing all of that that also convinced me that we needed to reframe this not as an arms control problem or even as a disarmament problem per se, but as a security and a humanitarian problem. And it was actually out of that the humanitarian process started to really develop. And it was very much recognizing the kind of, the hard issues. We've got all the nuclear weapon-free zones that we have been able to get. The hard issues are South Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Northeast Asia. Why? Because there are nuclear weapons in those areas, and you have to find a way to tackle them. So a lot depends on your theory of change. And unfortunately, the kind of arms control theory and the way that we've been doing things for quite a long time have been, you try to set the terms that have to be met before you can actually start the process to move things towards it. I know that the ACRS process actually started a process and tried to get it working. So that was one exception. It seems to me that we have to set the objectives very, very clearly, and we've got to make sure that we have a process that is open to all and therefore inclusive. But ultimately, it must not give any vetoes, and that includes, therefore, recognizing that even in terms of its process, if a state chooses to boycott, that is the state choosing not to be in the negotiating room while decisions are being made that will affect its security. And actually, this is what's happening with the UN process. The UK, the US, Russia, they're boycotting. A few other countries are boycotting. But they can't stop this happening. And under international humanitarian approaches, actually, we can get laws that apply. This happens in our own countries. You don't necessarily get all the kids that are murdering each other with guns and knives to come into the room and agree before you make sure that you have laws that allow the authorities, if you like, to apply laws that prohibit the carrying of guns, the carrying of knives, the murder with, and so on. And we have to start thinking about that more in terms of international politics and treaties. And that's really what we're going to be trying to do. Now, I know it's not going to be easy, and it's not necessarily going to be fast, but I've already seen how this has given greater impetus to debates even in Israel, by making it a humanitarian issue rather than a get the weapons out of Israel and make a zone when the conditions aren't met that Israel thinks it wants the zone and all of this. Actually, Dr. Ira Helfand, who did the famine report, went to Israel and talked about that in very direct terms to, meetings all over Israel and to the government. And really showed very clearly what would be the impact if any Israeli weapon were detonated, whether by accident or intention. It would absolutely devastate that country and all the people within Israel and Palestine. It would absolutely devastate the region. And this started to make people think about how they could possibly find a way out of that dilemma. And therein lies a beginning. So I actually think that once there is a prohibition treaty, some of these other issues are going to begin to find solutions, including things like a fissile material production ban, which may not end up being a multilateral treaty in the CD. It may be a treaty among the countries that actually are producing fissile material and so on. Very briefly on the Brexit, it's really, Brexit is potentially a major security threat to this, as well as economic disaster or challenge, at least for the UK, and also threat to stability in Europe and therefore for the world. With regard to your specific question, Euratom obviously comes to mind because it is a European Union treaty, and it is the one a treaty that actually monitors all the UK nuclear facilities. The IAEA doesn't, because the UK as a nuclear weapon state is in a very particular kind of position, but Euratom actually does. And so, but I mean, there could be, if the politicians and the technicians and the government are willing to show a little bit of wisdom in this process, then actually they could probably negotiate some kind of bilateral agreement with Euratom, even with the UK going out of the EU, by which there could be some agreement that all of Euratom's inspections and things would continue to apply to the UK. But I'm not actually very, from what I've seen since that vote in June last year, I'm actually not sanguine that they're sensible enough or intelligent enough to understand how all of these things connect. So, yet again, I'm looking to other kinds of processes to change things for the better and increase security. Thank you.
At the end, you can consider Rebecca the first NPT, the NPT first lady.
The proposal of the International Panel on Fissile Material, which has been meeting here, has really been pushing the idea of getting at this problem of nuclear weapons through the materials, and from the bottom up in the case of the Persian Gulf region now, and from the top down in terms of making global proposals to end reprocessing and to end national enrichment. But nothing will happen without, I think, a higher level of activism. And both Rebecca and I are veterans of a wave of activism that from the 1980s, when in response really to concerns that the Reagan administration was really thinking about the possibilities of fighting and winning a nuclear war. That caused the uprising, and in combination with the good luck of having Gorbachev in Moscow, made it possible to end the Cold War. So we need a new wave of activism, and I think our President Trump is certainly in the United States has been triggering a wave of activism, and I hope some of that will flow into the nuclear issue. With regard to Israel, I know Israel's nuclear program is an irritant in the Middle East, just like the U.S. and the Russian nuclear programs are irritants and globally. Not clear to me, though, that we'll be able to deal with Israel separately from the global nuclear weapon problem. With regard to the future of the Iran deal, was made made possible by a coalition between doves in Washington and doves in Tehran. We now have a more hawkish situation in Washington, and we'll know soon. I don't know when's the election.
Early May.
Early May. We'll know soon about the situation in Iran, but we have to. We have to do everything we can to defend the progress we made with that deal. You're not the only ones who are concerned about President Trump. For me, the fact that one man, I think one of the questions was, does Trump have it in his power to use nuclear weapons without any checks and balances? And the actual fact is, legally, yes, Trump has the authority to use nuclear weapons first, for whatever reason. Whether in practice people would obey him is not so obvious. But in fact, I think it does put a point on the something which President Obama was pushing toward the end of his administration, the idea of U.S. adopting, in effect, a no first use policy for starters. Then there are other dangers of accidental nuclear war that also have to be dealt with.
I think we have time for maybe another round of questions.
So, my name is Shelby Serdick. I'm a master's student here at AUB. And in Professor von Hippel's presentation, you emphasized that there's a very small amount of highly enriched uranium in the Middle East. But I'm curious about the amounts of slightly enriched uranium that might be present in the Middle East. And in asking about that, I'd like to draw your attention to a study that was published in Conflict and Health in 2011 by Samira Alani and a group of other researchers who are curious about investigating the association between depleted uranium and congenital birth defects in Fallujah. This team of researchers took a cohort of 25 mothers in Fallujah who had given birth to children with congenital birth defects and tested the hair for the presence of uranium. They also tested soil and water from Fallujah for uranium and other heavy metals. They found elevated concentrations of uranium in the mother's hair, as well as in soil and water. However, the isotopic signature of the uranium was not depleted uranium, but enriched uranium. And regarding that, the authors wrote that it demonstrated the existence of enriched uranium in the Fallujah environment, since none of the other elements found in excess in the parents were genotoxic except for uranium. We conclude that these results support the belief that the effects in Fallujah follow the deployment of a uranium-based weapon or weapons of some unknown type. So I'd like, I guess, to get your perspective on the conclusions of that study and what they might suggest for security in the region. Thank you.
Any more questions? All right, well, in that case, Frank, if you'd like to answer.
I'd be interested in looking at that article that you mentioned. Maybe I can give you my card. There was depleted uranium used by tanks in the Desert Storm in 1991. I don't know geographically. Fallujah is in Iraq, and that I'm not sure. That's, I think, a long ways from the battlefield. So I don't know how to explain the. Sorry, it's my wife. I'll have to call her back. So I don't know. I can't explain that. I'd be happy to look at the article and see if I can give any useful reaction.
Certainly, I think we're all aware that depleted uranium has been used for some time for the hardening of shells for bunker busting, for example, and was used in the Iraq wars, and was used also for busting tanks. And there's long been concerns about the contamination of that in terms of the toxicity. And so I am actually not surprised to hear of depleted uranium turning up in mother's hair and children. I think there's a very significant danger there. What is interesting me, and I will also have to read the study and the data, is that would be expected from the role that has been assigned to depleted uranium as a very, very hard metal that is able to penetrate tanks and bunkers. But you've said that enriched uranium is turning up there. And I think that is extremely interesting to hear, but I would need to look at the studies and see how how careful and thorough they are.
I think Professor Yusra Boushadi would like to make a comment as well.
Actually, you asked a very interesting question, and as a witness to what happened in Iraq, I can state my statement actually, because I was an inspector, belonged to the IAEA, and I did many, many inspections in Iraq. I did one private visit to a shelter called Al-Amiriya shelter in Baghdad. That shelter was bombarded by 2 American bombs. The first one was a uranium bomb. Irrespective, depleted or natural or enriched, it is the same. It's not meant for a nuclear, it's meant for the heavyweight, the density of the material. You know, the uranium is the heaviest density in nature. And it was used by some countries, particularly US is very well advanced in using depleted uranium or uranium, in mostly depleted uranium because they have a lot of enrichment facility. Uranium has no use, and they are using actually depleted uranium. So what I saw myself really, what happened in this shelter, the first ones they used the depleted uranium because it's a very high dense, so it had a very strong penetration, and it went into about 4 floors underground, and followed immediately by a second one with explosive. And the second one, when it was exploded in this shelter, the people, which were actually people, all women and the children and young people and etc., they thought actually Saddam was somewhere there, really. And the water, underground water, came and boiled. I saw myself with my eyes, really, parts of the human being, especially this part of the fingers here, were on the wall, and I saw a lady, sorry, it's not, I don't want to be so much dramatic, but a lady lost her husband and 5 children in that shelter. She was the one who stays there as the guide to tell the story to all people visiting it.
Professor Abu Shadi, sorry, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you. This is really important, but I think perhaps we can maybe continue the discussion. If you would like to make a final remark or conclude.
No, let me conclude. Okay, this one is just a witness, but what I'm saying really that this type of bomb had been used in your country here. I don't know if you are Lebanese or not. In the south of Lebanon, these are used in Gaza when actually Israel started to try to get deep into these tunnels, especially between Gaza and Egypt. And it was used in Syria when they claimed really they bombarded a nuclear reactor in Syria. And then the IAEA said we found uranium in this site of Al-Kibar. So it has a history in the Middle East. Unfortunately, is a bad history. Sorry to tell you that, but your question really raised all my memory.
Thank you very much, Professor. I was wondering if we have any final questions or comments from the audience. Yes, Muhammad.
Mohammed Basel Kazzaz. I'm currently a research assistant under the Energy Policy and Security Program at IFI. My question is to Dr. Rebecca. I understand that the vision for the next years of disarmament of nuclear weapons is going, and we have high hopes of seeing the trend going from really large numbers of nuclear weapons and up to, I think, 20,000 officially declared nuclear weapons in the world. But I'm concerned about what's going on in the black market. I mean, the black market about nuclear and nuclear technology has been active for maybe the years of since the nuclear technology was present, and especially between Iran and Pakistan and other countries. So any comment regarding the black market of nuclear technology?
Yeah, I think the estimates are actually about 15,000 nuclear weapons now, so it has gone down, but as I said, in the countries that have them, the 9, it is being constantly modernized and so on. So it's not actually disarmament, it's a kind of rationalization and continuation. But you've asked about the black market, and the height of the black market, really, I mean, the AQ Khan network, and things as far as we know, and I don't know if Zia has...
Sorry, Rebecca, can you please tell us a little bit about the AQ Khan for those who don't know?
Abdul Qadir Khan was a Pakistani scientist who worked for many years at Urenco in the Netherlands, and so he gained a lot of expertise. And then he took that expertise and went back to Pakistan, and he's regarded certainly by Pakistanis as the father of the Pakistani nuclear weapon. Some of you may remember in 1998, India and Pakistan both conducted a series of nuclear tests in May of 1998, and since then have developed nuclear arsenals, and both are regarded as, in their different estimates, but between 100 and 120, as I see different estimates, that they've both now developed as part of their arsenals. But what AQ Khan did for quite a long time, partly also to get the money to carry on, and also by exchange, was he ran essentially a black market. And this was a way for North Korea, for example, to get some of the, as far as I understand, some of the enriched uranium that they use, and also then for North Korea to be giving what was actually a Russian model of a missile to Pakistan. And so you had this kind of exchange going on. And of course, in all of that, there was the potential for, mostly it was actually state to state, or at least non-state actors that were nevertheless acting on behalf of states. And, Libya was involved, and a number of countries. Since that was broken in around about sort of 2002, 2003, 2004, there are still criminal gangs that may or may not be wishing to get hold of this kind of material. And every so often it comes up in the news. We know that there's major problems about transboundary criminal activities, trafficking in all, in arms, in people, in various other kinds of drugs. And I wouldn't rule out that there is still at least some efforts on this, but I think it is by and large being policed much more tightly now than it was prior to about 2002, 2003. So I think that's less worrying, but it is significant, and recognize that any treaty that now would be done to prohibit nuclear weapons activities would need not only to be addressed to states, but would also have to be addressed, as I said earlier, to non-state actors, and also bodies, corporations that are involved in prohibited activities, and the prohibited activities would be activities connected to all aspects of seeking to acquire either the highly enriched uranium, the plutonium, the missiles for specific, or nuclear warhead components. Now, the one thing that I didn't talk about is how you would monitor and verify that, because that is something that at this stage, going on the premise that you have to prohibit to kind of get a handle on it, and then you have to work out how you are going to actually do the elimination and make sure that safety and security and prevention are all put properly in place right across the world. Those things will need to be worked out, and they will take a lot of expertise, such as the expertise in IPFM, also in the IAEA and ABAC and Euratom and all of these, and also actually in the police services that are dealing with the other kinds of criminal networks for trafficking.
Thank you. On behalf of the Assam Affairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and on behalf of the audience, if I may And myself, I would like to thank our speakers, His Excellency Ambassador Mousavian, Dr. Johnson, Professor von Hippel, Professor Meehan, and thank the greater entity of IPFM for coming to Beirut and sharing with us those moments. Thanks again, my biggest thanks also to the audience for coming on such a stormy day. We appreciate it, and we hope the work and collaboration on these important issues will be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great questions.